Hi little skeletons, it is Disney Queen Skelly here, and welcome back to the Fun Facts. So today we're doing fun facts for the adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Enjoy! The song Headless Horseman is considered one of the darkest songs written for a Disney film. Much like Worthless from The Brave Little Toaster 1987 and Hellfire from The Hunchback of Notre Dame 1996, it was nearly cut from the film. While the characters are fictional, the place names and landmarks depicted in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow 1820 are mostly factual. The Tarrytown of the short story is the village of Tarrytown in Westchester County, New York. It was founded by Dutch settlers in the 17th century. It is located about 25 miles, 40 kilometers north of Midtown Manhattan in New York City. Some of the other landmarks are located in the nearby village of North Tarrytown, which was long nicknamed Sleepy Hollow and was officially renamed this name in 1996. Washington Irving himself was buried in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Rat describes Toad's latest obsession as a motor mania. This is the title of a classic Goofy short which would be released the following year, Motor Mania 1950. The information that the Headless Horseman died in a nameless battle of the American Revolutionary War 1775 to 1784 is not unreasonable. The province of New York was part of some major campaigns of the war and was the battleground for such battles as the Battle of Long Island 1776 and the landing at Kip's Bay 1776. However, Washington Irving probably took his inspiration from the Battle of White Plains 1779, which took place only 10 minutes from Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow. An American general, William Heath, wrote in his memoirs that he witnessed a Hessian horseman being decapitated by a cannonball during the battle. The body of the Hessian soldier was supposedly buried in an unmarked grave in the graveyard of Tarrytown's old Dutch church by the townspeople. Disney's original title for the movie was Two Fabulous Characters. Apparently, the only reason these two stories are linked together is the fact that their main characters are prone to disaster. The Headless Horseman is often cited as being along with the Firebird in Fantasia 2000, 1999, the Horned King in The Black Cauldron 1985, and Chernabog in Fantasia 1940 as one of the scariest villains in the Disney canon. Disney still receives complaints from parents about the character frightening their children. Thurl Ravenscroft was originally going to sing The Headless Horseman. His version of the song can be heard on the compilation CD Walt Disney Records Archive Collection Volume 1. The Toon Patrol, villains featured in Who Framed Roger Rabbit 1988, were designed and patterned after the weasels in the Disney version of The Wind in the Willows. The horse of Ichabod Crane has a name in the short story. He is called Gunpowder. The original plan for the Disney adaptation of The Wind in the Willows 1908 was that it would be a full feature film. After Walt Disney decided to reduce the adaptation to part of a package film, several scenes from the screenplay had to be cut to save time. These scenes were never animated. The narrators of the film, being Crosby and Basil Rathbone, were cast in the film to increase its audience appeal. Crosby was one of the most commercially successful singers from the 1930s to the 1950s. He had acted in several films and had already won an Oscar. Basil Rathbone was better known as the star of a film series about Sherlock Holmes with 14 films released between 1939 and 1946. There was a legend that one animator stopped working on The Wind in the Willows to join the army during World War II, and then returned 4 years later to continue work on the exact same film sequence. One of Disney's 4 package films. During World War II, the studio lost a lot of manpower and resources, which left it with countless unfinished ideas too long for shorts and too short for features. Inventive as Disney was, it stuck short ideas together into feature-length films. See also Make Mine Music 1946, Melody Times 1948, and Fun and Fancy Free 1947. To save money on animation, Katrina was modeled closely after Grace Martin from Make Mine Music 1946. She also greatly resembles Slewfoot Sue from the Pecos Bill segment of Melody Time 1948. While the Headless Horseman is a fictional character, he has mythological roots in English, Irish, German, and Scandinavian folklore. Ghosts on horseback are common in these tales, and a few of them are headless. For example, of ghosts on horseback, there is the widespread legend of the Wild Hunt. It features a phantasmal spectral group of huntsmen riding ghost horses and accompanied by ghost hounds. The entire group rides in mad pursuit across the skies, along the ground, or just above it. For Headless Horseman, there is the Irish legend of the Dullahan, a headless rider, usually on a black horse who carries his own head under one arm. While commonly known as Brombones, his full name is Abraham Van Brunt. Disney animator Andreas Deha used brom bones as an inspiration for Gaston in Beauty and the Beast, 1991. The idea to produce a film based on The Wind in the Willows, 1908, was suggested to Walt Disney in 1938. Since the novel featured anthropomorphic animals, it was thought that animation would be the ideal medium for an adaptation. Disney secured the rights to the novel the same year. The novel The Wind in the Willows, 1908, is the second work by Kenneth Grahame, 1859 to 1932, to receive a film adaptation by Disney. The first was the short story The Reluctant Dragon, 1898, which was adapted into a Disney film in 1941. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, 1820, was one of the works that both helped establish Washington Irving as a professional writer and gained a new audience for American literature in Europe. At the time, American writers had a particularly poor reputation, and some of the British readers expressed doubts whether Irving was actually American. During the live-action sequences in the library, the narrator mentions King Arthur, Robin Hood, and Oliver Twist, among other stories. Disney would eventually make these three, with The Sword in the Stone, 1963, Robin Hood, 1973, and Oliver and Company, 1988. The Magic Kingdom Park at Walt Disney World has a Sleepy Hollow restaurant inspired by this film. The exterior of the restaurant is a replica of Sunnyside Washington Irving's Dutch-style mansion on the Hudson River in Tarrytown, New York. The inspiration for Mr. Toad's wayward mischievousness and boastfulness is believed to be the son of his creator. Alastair Graham was a mischievous child with a tendency to boast about his exploits. Many fans have questioned whether or not Ichabod or Brom is the hero, as Ichabod's ultimate aim seems to be gaining Baltus Van Tassel's fortune. Greed is a frequent villain's motive in Disney films. Despite its American setting, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, 1820, was written while Washington Irving lived abroad, having settled in England. Most of his stories from the same period had English settings and featured English life and landscape. The production of the Disney adaptation of The Wind in the Willows, 1908, began in early 1941, but the film project was put on hold by October production, would not start again until 1945. Mr. Toad never actually drives a motorcar in the film. The superstitious beliefs of Ichabod Crane are attributed in the story to Crane having read The History of New England Witchcraft by Cotton Mather, 1663 to 1728, and believed it to be a factual account. There is actually no work by Mather under that name, though Washington Irving could be alluding to Mather's memorable providences relating to witchcrafts and possessions, 1689. Mather was a Puritan minister and prolific author, though best remembered for his role in the Salem witch trials, 1692 to 1693. He was both a firm believer in witchcraft and the supernatural and an influential champion of such beliefs. The character of Rat from The Wind and the Willows, 1908, has a misleading name. It does not match his species, since the novel depicts him as a European water vole. The water vole is a semi-aquatic rodent with a superficial resemblance to a rat. The character name likely derives from the term water rat, an informal name for the species. Despite its horror fiction elements, the short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow has a happy ending for all three of its main characters. Brom Bones and Katrina Van Tassel marry, Ichabod Crane leaves Tarrytown, and Sleepy Hollow forever finds work and success elsewhere. He keeps school at other places, studies law, and is admitted into the bar, acts as both a lawyer and a politician, and is last heard of as a justice of the 10-pound court. The settlement where the story takes place is called Tarrytown in the short story. The more famous name Sleepy Hollow comes from the vivid description in the story of a nearby glen which is said to be bewitched. The story of Ichabod Crane in the film is based on the short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, 1820, by Washington Irving, 1783 to 1859. Along the short story Rip Van Winkle, 1819, it remains one of the most popular and influential works by Irving. However, the stories were not at first attributed to him. He wrote under the pseudonym Geoffrey Crayon and attributed both the stories to fictional historian Diedrich Knickerbocker. Local tradition in the Sleepy Hollow area speaks of the decapitated corpse of a Hessian trooper that was discovered after a violent skirmish of the American Revolution War. It was reportedly buried in an unmarked grave in the old Dutch burying ground. The burying ground is also featured in Washington Irving's short story. Irving might have been familiar with the story and used it as the background of his Headless Horseman. There is a restaurant called Toad Hall in Disneyland Paris. From the outside, it strongly resembles Toad Hall from the movie. On the inside, there are many paintings of Thaddeus. The short story briefly compares the lanky Ichabod Crane to a scarecrow. The comic's character Scarecrow, a Batman villain, seems to be partly based on Ichabod Crane and resembles him in appearance. His real name is Jonathan Crane. Once Disney decided that The Wind in the Willows adaptation would be part of a package film, there was still the matter of which package film that would be. An early plan was to combine it with Mickey and the Beanstalk and the Gremlins. However, the Gremlin project never materialized and the Mickey project was ready for release before The Wind in the Willows was. By 1947, it was decided to combine it with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The horse of Brom Bones, which features prominently in the story and its adaptation, has a name. The story calls him Daredevil. He is a mostly untamed horse which only Brom can ride, with constant tricks which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck. Brom reportedly likes it this way. While the name Ichabod is rather rarely used, there was an actual historical figure called Ichabod Bennet Crane, 1787 to 1857, a career military officer best remembered for his role in the War of 1812 to 1815. While Washington Irving never admitted to borrowing his name, there is a strong possibility for it. The two men were acquaintances, having met in 1814. The Van in the last names Van Tassel and Van Brunt is Dutch for of/from. It indicates connection and/or origin from a geographic place. A Van Tassel is someone of Tassel. The German cognate is von and has the same meaning, though when part of a name it implies noble origin. Mr. Toad, as depicted in The Wind of the Willows 1908, does not work for a living. He inherited his wealth and Toad Hall from his family. He lives the life of a village squire. Similar to Fun and Fancy Free 1947 before, it was originally planned that Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio 1940 appear in this film to introduce the Wind in the Willows segment, but it was dropped. Washington Irving set the story about 30 years before its time publication, circa 1790. The weasels from the Disney version of The Wind in the Willows have become minor recurring characters in several Disney films, such as How to Be a Detective, 1952, Mickey's Christmas Carol, 1983, and The Prince and the Pauper, 1990. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow takes place from October to November 1790. Before its film adaptation, The Wind in the Willows 1908 had been adapted to a popular theatrical play, Toad of Toad Hall 1929, by A. Milne 1882 to 1956. Its main innovation was using as its basis only those chapters of the novel that deal with Mr. Toad and his adventures. The rest of the subplots, characters, and scenes of the novel were largely discarded. It was the first adaptation, but far from the last, to focus only on Toad. Kenneth Grahame never produced a sequel to The Wind in the Willows 1908. However, other writers have since produced a number of sequels and derivative works. For example, William Horwood has produced a series of 4 novels. Ichabod Crane can be seen as a typical gold digger, since the story contrasts his poor financial situation with the prosperity of the Van Tassel family and Katrina's status as an heiress. His reasons for becoming her suitor are strongly implied to be financial. The original short story connects the last name Crane to Ichabod's physical appearance. He is tall, lanky, and long-nosed, resembling the bird known as a crane. The full name of the Disney version of Mr. Toad is J. Thaddeus Toad, Esquire. This is not based on the novel. The film was the last of Disney's package films of the 1940s. Mostly for cost-cutting reasons, Disney released 6 package films from 1943 to 1949. They were Saludos Amigos, 1942, released in the U.S. in 1943, The Three Caballeros, 1944, Make My Music, 1946, Fun and Fancy Free, 1947, Melody Time, 1948, and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, 1949. These films were combinations of 2 or more shorter films into a full feature film. Most had no overall common theme. Disney returned to production of full-length animated feature films with Cinderella, 1950. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad was the studio's last package film until The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, 1977, 28 years later. The Disney version of Mr. Toad has made some appearances over the years, but rarely has a notable character. His most prominent one was the silent part of Fezziwig in Mickey's Christmas Carol, 1983. The 2 segments featured herein were subsequently released as independent featurettes on video. One of the main elements of the original short story by Washington Irving is that it is the story of a cultural outsider in an otherwise homogeneous community. Katrina Van Tassel, Abraham Brom Bones, and the rest of the locals are Dutch Americans of the state of New York, with the story explicitly calling them descendants of the original settlers of the colony of New Netherland. Schoolmaster Ichabod Crane is a recent arrival from Connecticut and has no real ties in the area. In the original short story, the Headless Horseman is the only one of the local legends of the supernatural. Among others mentioned is that of a German doctor who first bewitched Sleepy Hollow, and that of a Native American chief who served as both a prophet and a wizard to his tribe. Work on producing an animated version of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow began in December 1946. There are 2 hidden Mickeys in the road just after Toad first sees the motor car. Cyril's role is expanded from the original Wind in the Willows source material, going from simply being Toad's horse to his best friend and partner in crime. The character of Rat is dressed similar to the way Sherlock Holmes sometimes dressed, especially in the segment's narrator Basil Rathbone's movies about the great fictional detective. The animated character also slightly resembles Basil the Great Mouse Detective 1986, a popular character from the seminal 1986 animated Disney film of the same name, who was inspired by both Holmes and Rathbone. In the live-action segment in the library that introduces The Wind of the Willows, narrator Basil Rathbone mentions some of the most fascinating characters in literature, including Sherlock Holmes. Rathbone has become most famous for starring as Holmes in a series of films starting at 20th Century Fox and then at Universal. Katrina Van Tassel, or at least her name, may be based on one or two female figures from the Sleepy Hollow area in Westchester County. The Sleepy Hollow Cemetery contains the graves of Katarina Ecker Van Tassel and her niece Eleanor Van Tassel Brush. With this movie, aside from James Baskett and Edgar Bergen, who have both won honorary Academy Awards, Bing Crosby became the first Academy Award-winning actor to provide a voice-over role in a Disney movie. The novel The Wind in the Willows, 1908, is the most popular work by Kenneth Grahame, 1859 to 1932, who was not really a professional writer. He spent most of his time rising through the ranks as an employee of the Bank of England until his retirement in 1908. He published a few literary works in the 1890s and 1900s, but his literary output was small. He gave up writing after the publication of the novel. The background of the Headless Horseman as a Hessian trooper provides some implications about his origins. Hessian troopers were 18th century German auxiliaries contracted for military service by the British government, who found it easier to borrow money to pay off their service than to recruit its own soldiers. They took their name from the Landgraviate of Hesse-Kassel, a small state of the Holy Roman Empire. About half of the total number of Hessian troopers are estimated to have come from Hesse, the rest from Anhalt, Zerbst, Ansbach, Bayreuth, and Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel. I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing these wrong. Hanover, and Waldeck. Some individuals may have been from other German states. About 30,000 German soldiers fought for the British as an ally during the American Revolutionary War, making up a quarter of all the soldiers the British sent to America. They fought in their own traditional uniforms and their old regiments under the usual officers of their own flags. While the Disney film is a popular and influential adaptation of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow 1820, it is not the earlier one. It was preceded by The Headless Horseman 1922, an early horror film. First Disney animated feature film to have a surprise antagonist who didn't seem so evil at first until the true colors get revealed towards the climax, which is the case in this film for Winky in the Wind in the Willows segment. This would also be the case later on with Sword in the Stone 1963, Tarzan 1999, The Emperor's New Groove 2000, Atlantis: The Lost Empire 2001, Lilo and Stitch 2002, Meet the Robinsons 2007, Tangled 2010, Wreck-It Ralph 2012, Frozen 2013, Zootopia 2016, and Ralph Breaks the Internet 2018. The nickname Brom for someone named Abraham is somewhat rare. However, there is a Dutch name derived from Abraham which is similar. Bram, spelled with an A instead of an O. The Wind in the Willows takes place from June 10, 1909 to January 1, 1910. The original edition of The Wind in the Willows 1908 featured no illustrations despite the potentially interesting visuals of the characters. Subsequent editions often include illustrations by various artists such as Paul Bransom, 1885 to 1979, Ernest Howard Shepard, 1879 to 1976, and Arthur Rackham, 1867 to 1939. The two sections of the film have no common characters or theme, and are set in different time periods. Beginning in 1955, the two sections are frequently televised, released on home video, and otherwise marketed as two separate films. Toad's obsession with motor cars was somewhat unusual for the time the novel was written. While various motor car-like vehicles had been developed since the late 17th century, the first modern motor car is considered to be the Benz Patent Motor Wagon, 1886. The motor industry took off with several companies established over the following decades. But by 1908, the industry was still in its relative infancy, with a worldwide production of less than 60,000 motor cars per year. Mass production methods were in development but would not be perfected until the 1910s. In other words, motor cars were still relatively rare in the 1900s. The short story gives a background to the Headless Horseman, though not an actual name, a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. The original short story explicitly states that heiress Katrina Van Tassel is 18 years old, but is unclear about the ages of her suitors. Ichabod Crane and Abraham Brom Bones Van Brunt could be of similar age or older than her. It is left to the imagination of the reader. The last name Crane is indeed connected to the bird known as crane. The name is relatively common in both England and Scotland and less often appears in Ireland. Various crane families migrated to the American colonies in the 17th century, and some of them grew to relative prominence. For example, a Crane family from New Jersey produced some prominent politicians and military officers in the late 18th and 19th century. The Wind in the Willows, Toad actually did steal the motor car. In the Disney version, he simply signed over Toad Hall in exchange for it. Disney composer Oliver Wallace voices Mr. Winky. Some sources, however, list Alec Harford for that role. Walt Disney Animation Studios' 11th feature film and last one of the 1940s. Much of the animation was recycled for use in The Jungle Book. A large portion of the King Louie sequence was lifted from segments of the weasels chasing Mole and Brom dancing with the short lady. The first Disney animated feature film to have a character voiced by J. Pat O'Malley, Cyril Proudbottom. The inspiration of Mr. Toad's passion for motor cars is thought to be Francis Cecil Ricardo, 1852 to 1924, a motor enthusiast who drove an early Rolls-Royce. The only animated film to receive the short-lived Golden Globe for Best Cinematography, Color. When Angus McBadger is reading the telegram sent by people whose property Toad damaged, the first one is from J.R. Kinney, a reference to Jack Kinney, one of the film's directors. The second is from Hoffine Cox, referencing background artists Ray Huffin and Merle Cox, who also worked on this film. The collection in which the legendary Sleepy Hollow 1820 first appeared was the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman. It was published both in the United States and the United Kingdom and is considered among the earliest American literary works to achieve international success. The first British edition was by small-time publisher John Miller, who went bankrupt before managing to sell his stock. Washington Irving then turned to his friend Sir Walter Scott, who managed to secure a new edition of the work by the John Murray Publishing House. At the time, the Murray House was one of the most successful in Great Britain, since it was the main publisher for best-selling authors Jane Austen, Lord Byron, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, George Crabbe, and Sir Walter Scott. The edition helped secure the success of the work in the United Kingdom. Washington Irving is thought to have partly based his story of the Headless Horseman on a headless horseman featured in the Legends of Rubizal by folklorist Johann Carl August Musaus. I do apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong. 1735 to 1787. Rubizal is a mountain spirit associated with the Krkonos mountain of modern Czech Republic and Poland. He was a popular figure in German folklore, featured in multiple tales of the supernatural. The character of Rat has been theorized to be based on an acquaintance of Kenneth Gram, Frederick James Funival, 1825 to 1910. He was a prominent physiologist, a philologist, and dictionary editor with a passion for the sport of rowing. Mr. Toad has been seen as an example of the lovable rogue, a fictional character who tends to recklessly defy norms and social conventions, but who still evokes empathy from the audience or other characters. Ichabod Crane is apparently named after a minor biblical character. Ichabod appears in the books of Samuel, and his name is said to mean inglorious, because he was born in a day of military defeat. He is described as a grandson of High Priest Eli, a major figure of the books, and son of corrupt priest Phineas. His father is mostly remembered for his sexual activities with multiple women. Toad's horse didn't have a name in The Wind in the Willows, and only had a minor role in comparison. Cyril's role was expanded, and he is now Toad's most trusted friend and confidant. Various locations in Great Britain are considered inspirations for Kenneth Gram in his development of The Wind in the Willows 1908. For example, Toad Hall is believed to be based on either Maple Durham House or Hardwick House. The character Abraham Brom Bones Van Brunt has a biblical name. The name Abraham first appears in the book of Genesis, and the biblical character using his name is considered a major figure in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The name is rendered Abram, and Ibrahim in various languages. The name supposedly means exalted father, though the etymology is uncertain. When the Haunted Mansion attraction was added to Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom, it was placed in the area known as Liberty Square, which is designed to resemble an American colonial town. The original intent was to make the mansion themed on the story of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman, but this idea was scrapped, and the ride is more or less the same as the original version at Disneyland. Though it is one of the studio's more obscure titles, the film nevertheless inspired a popular Disneyland attraction which has been running continuously since the park opened in 1955, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. The name Katrina is derivative of Catherine/Catherine, K or C spelling. It derives from Greek feminine name Ikaterina or Ikaterine, and first appears in history with Catherine of Alexandria, a Roman saint with a significant cult in late antiquity and the Middle Ages. The meaning and etymology are uncertain, though some have suggested a connection with the goddess Hecate and Hecate, so basically they're spelled with a C or a K, whose name sounds similar. Other variants and related names include Catherine, spelled with a K, Catherine spelled with a C and a Y, Caitlin, Kathleen, Karen, Katerina, Karen, Catalina, so some of these are spelled with either like C's or K's or Y's or E's or A's, Kate, Caitlin, another Katerina, Kathy, Katie, Katina, or Katra, Katrine, Katriona, Ekaterina, Jekaterina, Yekaterina, Cassia, Kat, Katin, Ketty, Katie, Katia, Katya, and Trin/Trina. Alright, warning, spoilers ahead for the next few. It is unclear whether or not the Headless Horseman was a real ghost or was simply Brom in disguise. The original short story written by Washington Irving suggests that latter more overtly than the film. The best evidence in the film to suggest that Brom pretended to be the horseman is the similarity between the two characters' horses. However, if the horseman was in fact not Brom, then Brom's possible reasons for telling the story in the first place were either to spook Crane enough for him to leave town for good, to actually summon the demonic horseman with his song, or to make Crane so paranoid that he becomes careless on his way home and ends up having a serious accident. Another spoiler. The Headless Horseman is one of the few Disney villains to win. On the other hand, the ending ambiguously leaves up to the viewer to decide whether or not Crane escaped the demonic pursuer. And those are all of your fun facts for Ichabod, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye, little skeletons. Please stay safe. I love you guys.